Well, hello there. Happy Friday afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another live edition of Cannabis Chat. I'm Jimmy Young, the founder of Pro Cannabis Media, and every Friday afternoon we get together for a few hours of discussion about the latest issues in the world of cannabis. And joining me every Friday afternoon is our friend David Rabinovitz from Canna Venture. Hello, David. How are you today?
Great day, Jimmy. Good to be with you.
Glad that we are not outside in this 10-degree weather and below zero wind chill. And joining us is the new president of MASSCANN. His name is Grant Smith Ellis. Grant, thank you so much for joining us on this Friday afternoon.
Good to be with you, Jimmy. Thank you for having me again.
And you're a year older now, aren't you?
No, I stopped keeping track a few years ago, so.
Okay. Well, we won't wish you or sing to you a happy birthday again today, at least not until next year. How's that for a deal? Is that all right?
Sounds good.
Fair enough. All right. There's a major issue in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts that has kind of dominated the discussion in the cannabis world over the last month and has finally come to a conclusion of sorts. And it has to do with the now controversial new delivery licenses and a subsequent lawsuit that happened by the Commonwealth Dispensary Association of Massachusetts. And David, you and Grant have been right in the middle of this since the very beginning. So why don't you guys take it away, kind of give our viewers a little background on how we came to this and where we are right now that that lawsuit has been dropped.
Sure. But Jimmy, let me correct something. I really haven't been in the middle of it. I've been near the periphery of the center. Grant has been dead center in the middle of it.
Fair enough.
As the guy who knows what's going on, which is why we have him in as our special guest host for today.
There you go. All right. So now that, but I will say this, you've been in on it closer, even though you've been on the periphery more than I have, because you were my go-to guy when it comes to things happening in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, because you have a great resource with Grant. So Grant, why don't you give us a little background on how we came to be where we are right now?
It went from me nodding in agreement with your compliment to David turning it into a compliment of me. Anyway, but yes, David does do an excellent job keeping track of this information. And for anyone who hasn't checked out Dig Boston, he wrote an excellent 6-part series about the road to home delivery. So his modesty betrays in some sense his unwillingness to talk about indeed how much he has followed this story from the perspective of getting the information out there to the public, which I think is a noble pursuit, and you should be proud of that, David. Where we're at in terms of the adult use delivery is, folks have probably heard this discussion happen on this program before, but dating back for 3 years to when adult use cannabis was implemented in the Commonwealth, there was a plan to roll out delivery of that adult use cannabis. Medical cannabis is already being delivered in the state and has been for a year or two at this point. So that initial proposal in the fall of 2018 passed the Cannabis Control Commission 3-2. It would have created 2 different models for delivery, but it was delayed because the governor, the attorney general came in and asked the Cannabis Control Commission to put a little more time into their delivery rules. The governor and the treasurer, of course, are 2 of the 3 public officials that appoint the Cannabis Control Commission. So they each have an individual appointment to make up 3 of the 5 seats, and then the other 2 seats are appointed by the 3 of them together. So the point in all that is that the process to roll out these adult use delivery rules started right away back in 2018, but it took until the summer of 2020 for them to really get the process going and get around to deciding what the final regulations were going to look like. Now, 12 months before that, in the summer of 2019, they began thinking about rolling out adult use delivery, and they began doing it by creating a courier model. Now, this courier model looks a lot like Uber Eats, where you, as an equity delivery company, the licenses were only available to equity companies for 2 years at the time. As an equity company, you could own a fleet of cars, you could store it in your warehouse, but then you'd have to go to brick and mortar retailers, pick up orders and pay them retail price for it, and then you could deliver and get the delivery fee. And the reason ostensibly the commission approved that in the summer of 2018 or summer of 2019 was that, one, the commission thought it would be a low cost barrier to entry without realizing, of course, that it also meant giving up all the profits. And two, the commission said at the time, well, we're not ready to roll out another delivery license, but how about this? Micro businesses, which are cultivators up to 5,000 square feet, we'll give them a delivery endorsement. So they can now apply to deliver their own products directly. So that was the summer 2019. Now, summer 2020, all this information had come out over that 12 months because the courier license started to be available. So that meant equity companies were going to brick and mortar retailers and saying, I'd like to be a courier for you as a delivery company. What terms will you offer me? And what the retailers were saying in the spring of 2020 was, we want not only to keep all the profits on every sale, but if you want to deliver for even one of our locations, we want you to give us 9.9% of your company. Now, obviously, some equity delivery companies were, astounded by this. It was very predatory. And they went to the Cannabis Control Commission and said, clearly, what these retailers are doing is they want to have these equity delivery companies working as couriers for them for 2 years. And then they just want to open their own courier companies internally within their dispensary and get rid of the equity couriers. So you have to, if you could, commission, create a different model. So the commission heard what they were saying and said, all right, what if we created a model where you, as an equity delivery company, you could own a warehouse, you could own a vault, you could buy product at wholesale from cultivators and manufacturers, you can store it in the vault and then deliver it directly to consumers. And so they went ahead and created that. Throughout that whole time, the big brick and mortar dispensaries are fighting it, saying they're going to file a lawsuit if the commission goes forward with it. And on January 13th of this year, they did just that. They made good on their threat. And the lawsuit they filed was really, really bad. It was filed by the Commonwealth Dispensary Association, which is a group. It was a group of about 40 dispensaries on January 13th when they filed the lawsuit. And the lawsuit said a few things, but one, it sought to invalidate the entire 3-year equity priority period for delivery licenses. It sought to invalidate the entire delivery operator license, and it sought to allow dispensaries right away to have courier delivery licenses. So there would be no need even for equity delivery couriers. Well, on January 19th or 20th, the story broke that the lawsuit had been filed. One day later, an organic boycott started. Myself, a few other people started sharing some posts. It was designed intentionally, the boycott of the CDA over the lawsuit, to not be run by any one group so no one could influence, peddle, and shut it down. Within 24 hours, 4 or 5 companies left the Commonwealth Dispensary Association in protest. Within 48 hours, they had lost another 5 companies, and including 2 of the biggest companies in the state, Netta and Sierra. And by Sunday night, they had lost 12 companies, which would have been about $150,000 in yearly dues that they lost in 3 days, and they withdrew the lawsuit. So that was Sunday night, just the beginning of this week. Roll over into Monday morning, and it comes out, even after the suit's dropped, from sources that talk is already going around about refusing to work with these delivery operator licenses now that the lawsuit has been dropped. So the boycott continues. There's going to be in-person pickets, I hear, by equity companies. And the whole insight about this whole structure is that retailers thought they could use our regulations and our laws to have a functional market monopoly and be the only ones doing adult use delivery. And equity companies stood up. The community stood up, a huge group of people stood up and said a fair market means more than dictating only you are allowed to do delivery, and they won.
That was a great synopsis of what's going on. What bothers me when I hear stories like that is I don't understand why. Actually, let me rephrase that. I am upset why these things happen. Infighting and greed seem to be dictating a lot of action inside the cannabis industry. This is such a young industry. It's so early, and we're already seeing infighting, and everybody's looking to grab as much cash or money or control or power as possible instead of working together. And isn't that what an association of people, of like-minded people, is supposed to do? Why is it strictly greed, Grant, that's driving this?
No, I think it's the a byproduct of the way American society has functioned for hundreds of years. I don't think it's any different than Standard Oil making shady contracts with railroads, which were a public utility, to undercut independent oil towns and consolidate control of refineries. I don't think it's any different than Tammany Hall or any number of other political sort of strong arm tactics, because they all, at the end of the day, while there's middlemen who get power and whatnot out of it, the fundamental goal of companies in the American Republic is regulatory capture. And so it's very realist political doctrine on their part. They view laws and regulations as an extension of their ability to profit, and they thus look towards those laws to stifle competition. It's been the Sherman Antitrust Act was passed in 1890, and we've had the same fight going on ever since. And sometimes we get lucky and a politician comes around who can speak their language and stop them from engaging in that malfeasance. But most of the time they get away with it because they're very good at what they do.
David?
I could see that look in your face. So Grant, where do things go from here? Right? As it stands now, you guys did a phenomenal job. The CDA dropped their lawsuit. Then you ratcheted up a little bit more pressure, and Revolutionary Clinics dropped their lawsuit against the city of Cambridge. So as it stands right now, I think there's probably only one remaining piece of litigation, anti-social equity, that's going on. But the two big ones are gone. What's the next step? Is it just let's see how things unfold, or what are the concerns that you may have about bad actors or bad acts?
We talked a little bit about earlier, anti-competitive cabals threatening not to do business with delivery operators, but there are lists out there, and I'm sure we can post it somewhere in the comments or at some point, of companies. There are far more companies not in the CDA than in the CDA. So I think that's not as big of a worry. But just for the record, if anyone out there were thinking about trying to engage in an anti-competitive cabal, if you read 935 CMR 500-140 paragraph 17, you'll see that it says you cannot engage in that behavior, and the penalty is forfeiture of licenses. In any event, so that I don't know is so concerning. But what is concerning is, yes, okay, it's great that you talked about the lawsuit. For context, obviously we talked about the CDA anti-delivery lawsuit, but the Rev Clinics lawsuit was just as pernicious, in my opinion. They filed Rev Clinics as Revolutionary Clinics, a medical dispensary in Cambridge, in the summer of 2019. The city of Cambridge was thinking about creating an equity priority period for giving out host community agreements. And we talked in the past about how there's a bifurcated licensing system in the Commonwealth. So you before you can get a state level license, you have to get a local level license. Equity priority applies only for your state level license. So when you're going through the local process to get a cannabis license, there's no mandate that the city and towns take into consideration your equity status. But Cambridge wanted to do it anyway. So over the summer of 2019, they created and passed an ordinance in their city that would have created a 2-year priority period where only equity applicants could get adult use host community agreements in Cambridge. Revolutionary Clinics sued, claiming that that ordinance violated a section of state law, MGL 94G, Section 3, subsection A1I. And that section of the law says that medical dispensaries, cities and towns cannot use permitting ordinances to prevent medical dispensaries from co-locating as adult use dispensaries. So Rev Clinic sues, and in January of 2020, they get a ruling from Suffolk Superior Court Judge Kathleen, I forget her last name, but McCarthy, I think is the last name. But anyway, they get a ruling called an injunction, which basically prevented Cambridge from putting its equity priority period into effect. 4 months later, the city appealed under 231-118 to the single justice of the appeals court. And in April, there's this great ruling from Justice Dickoff of the appeals court, the single justice, saying that that word prevent would allow a city to delay conversion for up to 2 years for the period of an equity, for the purpose of an equity priority period. So then Rev goes back to the Superior Court in the summer of 2020, 6 months ago, and asks for another injunction. They get denied. Then in September of 2020, they go to the appeals court to appeal the denial of the second injunction, and they lose that as well. So they lost 3 times in a row in the case. But then a few days ago, CDA drops its suit. Rev Clinics, the suit had been ongoing even though they had lost 3 times in a row, dropped its suit. But I tell that whole story because my point, Jimmy, there is great. The CDA lawsuits dropped. The Rev Clinics lawsuits dropped. But let's be frank. Rev Clinics in, I believe it was August of 2020, submitted a motion for summary judgment in the Cambridge case where they called the equity priority period racially discriminatory against non-equity owned medical companies. And in that way, that's the point I was making. It's a mentality. It's not a lawsuit. It's not any one action or public policy position. It's a mentality that has been displayed time and time and time again by some of these companies. Their profits are more important than equity, apparently, and also more important than a fair market. And so long as that's their mentality, I don't know what the path forward is other than to point out what they're doing to stop them from popping up like whack-a-mole at every single chance they get, undermining public policy and regulations. That's what I would say is the path forward.
We are Pro Cannabis Media.